The Emperor Heraclius had had a remarkable reign, but to the south, in the sands of Arabia, an even more remarkable revolution was underway. In AD 610, while Heraclius was usurping the imperial throne, a Meccan by the name of Muhammad was experiencing certain revelations. By 622, Heraclius had his hands full with a catastrophic war against the Persians, and that very autumn won a well-needed victory over them. And Muhammad undertook his famous Hijra, his escape from Mecca to Medina. Both men spent the next years at war. Heraclius pulled off history's most spectacular comeback by defeating the Persians in 628, for which he celebrated a triumph the following year. Elephants, animals never before seen in Constantinople, pulled the emperor's chariot through the city. The exotic flamboyance on display that day was in keeping with the halo of triumph that clung to the emperor as he returned victorious from war, the last great war of the ancient world. Had he died then, no doubt he would be spoken of in the same breath as Aurelian, as Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Heraclius had been about 35 when he took the throne. Now, war-weary and weather-beaten after so many summers on campaign, he was in his 50s. He took his name from Heracles, but in his life and labours he came more to resemble Sisyphus. Syria, Palestine and Egypt, provinces only just recovered, were in disorder. It may have taken until 630, 2 years after the war's end, for Heraclius to secure the evacuation of all Persian forces from the region. The Great War had brought huge losses, and there was much work to be done to rebuild. There were divisions in the church that the emperor hoped to heal. There was also, in the eyes of many, a need for him to get his own house in order. Heraclius had by his first wife a son, Constantine, born in 612. Yet less than a year after his heir's birth, his empress died. This was not a huge issue in itself. Heraclius would just have to remarry. Except his next choice proved to be profoundly off-putting, even by medieval standards, for his bride-to-be was also his niece. Her name was Martina, and her union with Heraclius was denounced as incestuous, but the emperor would not be dissuaded. After tying the knot in 613, a clutch of children followed. At least 2 were disabled, something that contemporaries could not help but read as the punishment of God. Chief among Martina's brood was the Prince Heraclonas, born in 626, who was inevitably set against his elder half-brother, Constantine. The emperor himself may have hoped to keep the family together, but the controversy that clung to Martina, as a result of the emperor's decision to marry her, meant that she had lots of enemies. Meanwhile, the entire world was standing on the cusp of a new era. Starting with skirmishes in 629, incredibly animated and organised Arab raiders began to probe the defences of the empire. The raids became invasions in 634, and from that point it took the Arabs just 4 years to conquer the Levant. These were not mere raiders, it was clear. Nor were they simply Arabs. Later stories told of a letter, penned by the Prophet Muhammad, that was sent to Heraclius, urging him to convert to the true faith, with that being Islam, of course. The emperor was apparently impressed with the new religion and its prophet. Of course, this tale is apocryphal, and in truth the Romans of the age probably did not immediately grasp that a new religion was emerging. The Arab Muslims were at first identified primarily in ethnic terms. A fuller understanding came later. Heraclius, now over 60, was too old and too unwell to lead an army. From his base in Antioch, he awaited news of the battle, one of the most important in history. It was fought in 636 at a place called Yarmouk, and it was a stonking Muslim victory. The imperial army was pummeled, and all Heraclius could do was retreat and retrench further north. The empire entered freefall. What a rich land this is for the enemy, the emperor lamented bitterly, as he gazed upon Syria for the last time. And so it proved. Damascus, that great Syrian metropolis, would serve as the capital of the Islamic Empire from 661 to 750. Further counteroffensives failed, and now Heraclius's life was nearing its end. He proclaimed Heraclonas, his son by Martina, co-emperor in 638. Bear in mind that he had already given this rank to his eldest son Constantine in 613. Clearly it was his intention for both Constantine and Heraclonas to rule after him. He was certainly keen to reinforce the idea that all was well in the imperial family, even as rivalries simmered between his heirs. Finally, on the 11th of February AD 641, just as Muslim armies were conquering Egypt, the Emperor Heraclius breathed his last. He had lived for 65 years, just long enough to see his achievements crumble to dust. It was now up to his sons to manage this sinking ship, but the house of Heraclius was divided. On one side stood the 28-year-old Constantine III, and on the other was the 14-year-old Heraclonas with his mother. Two other sons of Martina, David and Martinus, had also been raised to high rank. Then, barely 3 months after his father, Constantine III died, leaving behind an 11-year-old son. This was good and bad news for Heraclonas. Good, because their faction was now in sole control of the throne. Bad, because many in the capital held them squarely responsible for Constantine's death. The young emperor had probably perished of natural causes, but alas, Heraclonas's reign did not even outlast the year, in which time the city of Alexandria was lost to the Muslims. In the winter, a general called Valentinus, loyal to the memory of Constantine, led an uprising against the sons of Martina. Heraclonas, David and Martinus were mutilated and exiled, dying shortly after. The empress herself fared little better, and her tongue was slit. We do not know when she met her end. The general Valentinus then placed the 11-year-old son of Constantine on the throne. This boy was Constans II. In the past year he had witnessed his grandfather, father and uncles fall one after the other. Worse still for the empire, the Muslims showed no signs of slowing down. The conquest of Egypt had opened the road to the rest of North Africa. The emperor was too young to rule for himself, though this did not stop him from giving a speech to the Senate, essentially ragging on Heraclonas and Martina. A regency council handled affairs for the first part of his reign, heading off a coup d'état by Valentinus in 644. Religious divides helped to fuel a rebellion in North Africa in 646, only for the Arabs to invade and slay the rebel leader in battle the following year. Africa was henceforth forced to pay tribute to the Caliphate for a decade. It was also around this point that the last holdouts of the Persian Empire were conquered by the Muslims, who continued to launch attacks by both land and sea against the Eastern Romans. In 655, the emperor's attempt to crush their sea power went disastrously wrong. Leading the navy himself, Constans was nearly killed, and only escaped by swapping clothes with one of his men. Yet the empire did receive a lucky break the following year, when the Islamic Empire, the Caliphate, collapsed into civil war, giving Constans time to address issues elsewhere. The emperor campaigned in the Balkans, defeating marauding Slavs, and then plunged deep into the east. He visited the lords of Armenia and Azerbaijan, dispersing gifts and titles to them to win them over. This frontier region and its rulers would forever be swinging between the empire and the Caliphate as it tried to maintain its independence. The imperial territories in Africa also took advantage of the Caliphate's civil war to stop paying tribute. But with the empire's disparate holdings under so much pressure, Constans decided he could not manage things properly from Constantinople. Henceforth, the Sicilian city of Syracuse, halfway between Africa and Anatolia, was to serve as his capital. But in such disordered times, just getting to Sicily became quite the odyssey. He set off in early 662, sailing to Thessalonica, where he defeated some Slavs, and then decamped to Athens for the remainder of the year. Only in 663 did he make it to Italy. Once the heartland of the Roman Empire, much of the peninsula now answered to Lombard masters, and Constans did his best to shore up his holdings there. His target was Benevento, the capital of a large Lombard duchy. The Lombards of the south put up little resistance, but sent for assistance from the king of the Lombards, Grimoald, who dispatched a large relief force. The emperor had to be quick, and so he turned to trickery. Grimoald had sent a messenger ahead to reassure the Beneventans, but Constans captured him and promised to spare him if he told the Beneventans no help was coming. Up went the lad, who cried out that reinforcements were on their way. Foiled, the emperor had the messenger beheaded and his body flung by catapult over the walls. He next retreated to Naples and finally paid a visit to the city that had started it all, Rome. No emperor had set foot here for nearly 2 centuries. Unfortunately, the honour of an imperial visit was not all that it had been, and in these trying times Constans ended up looting many of the city's valuables, stripping the Pantheon of its copper. Finally, the emperor made it to Syracuse in the autumn. The city was to be his capital for 5 years. This was the last time an emperor decided to voluntarily shift his capital, and in this case it reflected the many-pronged challenges of the age. Africa and Italy, both valuable lands, were only tenuously held by Constantinople. In Africa's case, imperial control had been severely undermined by the rebellion of 646 and had not yet recovered. Back in Constantinople, his eldest son, Constantine, managed affairs. Constans had 2 other sons, Heraclius and Tiberius, and all 3 of them can still be seen today in the mosaics of the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare in Ravenna. Anyway, when the Muslim civil war ended in 661 with the triumph of the Umayyad dynasty, the Arab attacks quickly resumed. Constans never returned east, all the while Arab armies ranged far and wide, as far west as Bithynia, and in the year 666 the situation became critical. An imperial general rebelled, inviting the Muslims into Anatolia, and the following year the Arabs were encamped at Chalcedon, just across from Constantinople. Their attacks on the walls failed, but for 2 years they had the city in a vice, and in 668, as they stared down the barrel, the citizens of Constantinople heard that their emperor was dead. He had been killed in the bath with a bucket. There were worse ways to go, I suppose. Constantine IV, his 16-year-old son, now ruled in the capital, and word of his father's demise was soon followed by even worse news. The armies in Sicily had revolted. Few emperors faced such a baptism of fire, but Constantine rose to the challenge. He was a sober and skillful ruler, adroiter and more tactful than his father had been, and he immediately got to work. The rebellion in Sicily was suppressed, while the Arabs eventually pulled back their forces from Constantinople circa 670. The new decade saw a revival of Eastern Roman fortunes, with imperial forces scoring victories on land and sea. The dizzying pace of Muslim conquest was finally starting to slow, and the new emperor also achieved a significant spiritual victory in 681 with the conclusion of the Sixth Ecumenical Council at Constantinople, restoring harmony within the church. But the year before had seen a severe military defeat when the Bulgars, a Turkic steppe tribe, crushed a Roman army just south of the Danube. These Bulgars established a kingdom south of that great river, eventually mixing with the Slavs they ruled over to form the nation of Bulgaria. Constantine IV died in 685, with this defeat the sole black mark on an otherwise great reign. At this point it might be worth stopping to take a look around. The giant edifice of the Roman Empire had crumbled massively. Beyond its obvious reduction in size, the decline of its cities was another clear change. Although the extent and nature of this varied from place to place, a downward trend can be seen pretty much everywhere. Another change was the collapse of large landowners, replaced by networks of small farmers. The Balkan hinterland was entirely lost, and the emperor's writ ran no further than the coast in many places. The sea of Slavic settlement, punctuated only by the occasional imperial stronghold, stretched as far as southern Greece. Thessalonica had nearly fallen to the Slavs in the 670s, and it required fighting on the next emperor's part to open up the land route from there to the capital in the 680s. The process of reasserting imperial control had a long way to go. Africa and Italy, both tenuously held, were unified into large commands called exarchates in hopes of making them more self-sufficient. The exarch in Italy was based at Ravenna, while Africa's exarch ruled from Carthage. Old ways had to adapt to this new age. Towards the end of the period in question for this video, the Eastern Romans began to eschew direct military confrontation. Instead of marching to stop an invader, they relied on defence in depth, drawing them in to strain their lines of supply. Head-to-head fights were deemed too risky, as the Arabs got the upper hand in most battles. Chastened by this period of disaster, imperial generals started only to pick fights they were sure they could win, such as when small detachments were split off from an invading Arab force. The Taurus mountains that scraped the sky also shielded the eastern approaches to Anatolia, making further Muslim conquests difficult. The Eastern Romans used ambushes to wear the Arab invaders down, while they too raided across the frontier into Muslim-held lands. A depopulated frontier region formed as a result of all this raiding, which served as a buffer to the imperial lands. But as I said, this shift in strategy only fully took place towards the end of the Heraclian period. There was also a pressing need to build up the empire's strength at sea. The empire was menaced by devastating Arab sea power. Cyprus was first ravaged, and soon Muslim fleets had penetrated the Aegean Sea, until even the capital was under threat in the 660s. Despite the disastrous warfare, the system of imperial administration remained robust and efficient, adapting to the new demands of the age. The field armies, or what remained of them, were withdrawn and resettled in Anatolia. Here the armies were each assigned a large military district. The names of these districts reflected where the field armies had come from. The Armeniakon was the old field army of Armenia, the Thraikession was the old field army of Thrace, and so on. In time, these districts came to be known as themes. Most of the treasury was spent on the army, yet this was no longer enough. And while it's not entirely clear, it seems that at some point the soldiers acquired lands for their upkeep. Responsibility for maintaining a soldier was probably also shared with his family. Unfortunately, however, there is much we are still unsure about on this subject. The themes did not immediately replace the old network of Roman provinces, and for a while the two layers of administration existed simultaneously, the provinces handling civilian affairs, the themes military affairs, until the themes absorbed the province's civilian functions in the 9th century. These changing institutions and challenging outlook were inherited by the son of Constantine IV. If you like the content you see here on Atlas History, then make sure to subscribe. It's free and really helps me out. The channel has recently had a name change. It was Serapeum, and now it's Atlas History. Don't worry, nothing else has changed. I'm still here and I'll still be making history content, so stick around for that. And if you want to massively support the channel, then consider becoming a YouTube member or supporting me on Patreon. It's really the best way to support the channel, especially when high-quality historical resources can be so expensive. Anyway, on with the rest of the video. The next emperor was one of the most memorable figures the empire ever produced. He was energetic and ambitious, but had several fatal flaws, the first of which was perhaps his name. For Justinian is the most famous name in Eastern Roman history, but not because of this emperor, the second Justinian. A century prior, The first Justinian had ruled magnificently at great cost, and his namesake may have tried to imitate the lavishness and ambition of his rule. The reign of Constantine IV had marked the start of stabilisation, yet there was much work to be done, and no room for rashness. Justinian II certainly had the courage and competence to see his plans through to success, but his ambitions necessarily brought on heavy taxation, and his personality was shot through with a terrifying streak of impatient rage. And when things did go awry, his anger was without parallel. Fortunately for him, the first years of his reign went smoothly. Partly this was due to external circumstances. Ever since 680, the Caliphate had been mired in a second round of civil war, and the Muslim warlord nearest the empire, Abd al-Malik, was actually paying Justinian for peace. An interesting clause of their agreement concerned a group of rampaging Christians known as the Mahdaites. From their base in Lebanon, they had resisted and terrorised the Muslim authorities, but now they would be evacuated and settled within Anatolia. But the Mahdaites were not the only settlers Justinian introduced into Anatolia. He took advantage of the peace with the Arabs to campaign against the Slavs in Europe, moving many over into Anatolia, where he hoped they could repopulate the empire's ravaged core. A second noteworthy clause of the treaty between Justinian and Abd al-Malik was that Cyprus became a demilitarized zone, and its revenues were split equally between the emperor and the caliph. The revenues of Armenia were also shared in a similar way, but the amazing thing about the situation on Cyprus was that it held for nearly 300 years. Despite constant warfare between the empire and the Muslims, Cyprus and its people were mostly insulated from the fighting. While Justinian was trying to restore his people's demographic strength, he also turned an eye to their morals. In 692 he summoned a religious council, the so-called Quinisext, to regulate various minor matters. For example, it was forbidden to dance around a bonfire at the new moon, as was invoking the name of the pagan god Bacchus during the grape harvest. And let's not even start on those with the libidinous temerity to curl their hair in a provocative or seductive manner. In all seriousness though, these bans ironically help shine a ray of light on the past. Nobody bans something that nobody does, so this gives us an idea of the ancient, sometimes pagan rituals that these Christian country folk still clung onto even then, and in some cases still do now. The Muslim civil war also ended in 692, with Abd al-Malik emerging victorious. And immediately the fighting between the Arabs and Eastern Romans resumed. Justinian dispatched his army, strengthened by many Slav settlers. Yet when the two sides clashed, the Slavs defected, and the Romans suffered a terrible defeat. It was said that the emperor, utterly furious, ordered the massacre of thousands of Slavs as revenge. Men, women and children were fed to the sword in droves to slake Justinian's lust for blood. This particular story is probably exaggerated, but the fact that it was told at all gives you an idea of his fearsome reputation. After a decade, the people had wearied of their emperor, and in 695 he was deposed. Worse still for him, his nose was cut off. This was common practice at the time. Emperors were supposed to be without imperfections, and mutilating pretenders to the throne in this way was meant to disqualify them. Back in 641, Heraclonas and his brothers had all lost their noses. Constantine IV, suspicious of his own brothers, had both their noses slit in 681. Now Justinian joined the Voldemort Society. The people were done with him. But he was not done with them. Nursing his nose, Justinian eventually fled to the lands of the Khazars in what is today Ukraine. Here, sheltered by the Khagan of the Khazars, he plotted his revenge. He married the Khagan's sister, renamed Theodora, but even this did not keep him safe in his new home. Justinian's brother-in-law was promised a vast sum of money by the emperor in Constantinople if the exile was made to disappear. The Khagan, torn between greed and family loyalty, eventually made his choice. One day, as a show of friendship, the Khagan gave Justinian a new bodyguard of honour. But he was no fool. Justinian knew that he was now surrounded by his murderers. So what was he to do? Well, he invited one of the two men he suspected to dinner. Once there, he killed him with his bare hands. And then he did the same thing to the second. With Khazar blood on his hands, Justinian had no choice but to flee and mount his revenge bid for the throne. He left his Khazar wife Theodora behind. Pregnant with his child, she was in no condition to travel, but at least Justinian could count on her brother treating her kindly. He meanwhile was sailing away. The Black Sea goes by a different name in Greek, one given in irony. Oefxinos Bondos it is called, the Hospitable Sea. Justinian got a taste of that hospitality when storms tossed his ship about, but eventually he made it to his destination, Bulgaria. He allied himself with the Bulgarian Khan, Tervel, and marched on Constantinople with his armies. The man who deposed Justinian had lasted only 3 years before being deposed and denosed in turn. So the exile returned to find that the current emperor was Tiberius III, a former admiral. His reign had proven successful so far, and the people were not keen to readmit their erstwhile tyrant into the city. But Justinian, ever the practical man, snuck in via an underground passage. He and some soldiers materialized inside the walls, seized the palace, and Constantinople was his. The Emperor Tiberius took flight, to no avail. He was beheaded alongside his predecessor, the man who had first deposed Justinian. It was 705, and after a decade, the house of Heraclius was back on the throne. The emperor had plenty of scores to settle, so he set about destroying his enemies, simultaneously rewarding Khan Tervel with the most time-hallowed title he could give, that of Caesar. The Khagan of the Khazars, eager to get back into Justinian's good books, sent him his wife. For the first time in 2 years, the emperor saw his empress, and for the first time ever, he saw his son, a tiny baby boy with the unfortunate name of Tiberius. And the people saw something else for the first time too, for it was clear that their cold-hearted, hateful emperor was in love. Yet few others found themselves on the receiving end of that love, for his years in exile had made him bloodier and harsher than ever. One telling measure of his historic unpopularity is that the name Justinian actually disappeared during the 8th century. Nobody wanted their baby to share a name with the tyrant. Justinian's second reign was blighted by military failure. Marauding Balkan tribes dealt the Byzantines a stinging defeat in 708, as did the Arabs the following year. And just as he was losing to the Muslims, Justinian was also at war with his Italian subjects. The situation in the west was deteriorating. Africa had been lost to the Arabs back in 695, and Italy had been rocked by mutinies in recent years. Perhaps for disloyalty then, Justinian unleashed an army on Ravenna, the imperial HQ in Italy. The city's notables were arrested and most were executed, save the bishop, whom Justinian blinded instead. Usually it was Rome that resisted the emperor's will, but this time the roles were reversed. Pope Constantine, a Syrian fluent in Greek, was ready to compromise with the emperor on the rulings of the Quinisext Council, the one Justinian had called back in 692. The Pope travelled east, and in spring 711 was warmly welcomed into the imperial capital. Finally, in the city of Nicomedia, Pope and Emperor met face to face. It was the last such meeting for 6 centuries. Suffice it to say that when next an emperor and pope met, it was in very different circumstances. They hammered out an agreement on the canons of the Quinisext that pleased both sides, and then the pope sailed home, arriving back in Rome in October. 1 month later, Justinian and his family were butchered, and the Heraclian dynasty, the most successful dynasty to date, was over. The emperor's tyranny had caught up with him for the second time, and this time his enemies took no chances. He was captured 12 miles out from Constantinople and beheaded. The headless body was flung into the sea, while the noseless head was brought to the next emperor as a trophy. It's a hard knock life. And the worst was not over yet. The House of Heraclius had ruled during one of the most chaotic periods in the empire's history. The pace of collapse during the 7th century rivaled the speed at which the Western Roman Empire fell to pieces during the 5th. But unlike the West, the East survived. The moment of greatest peril still lay ahead. Starting in 717, 6 years after Justinian's demise, Arab armies laid siege to Constantinople. For 12 historic months, the future of Europe and Asia hung in the balance, until at last the defenders triumphed. That victory in 717 marked the end of mortal danger, but we must not forget the period that preceded it. Indeed, for the Eastern Romans it was an era of embarrassing defeats and constant retreat, with imperfect emperors barely managing to cling on. But cling on they did, and under immense pressure they preserved a core that could eventually grow and reclaim some of the lands lost. The fact is that as the Middle Ages dawned, the empire itself was only barely middle-aged. When that huge army laid siege to Constantinople in AD 717, 744 years had passed since the first emperor first ruled. And there were still 746 years to go until the last. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. It's really your support that makes the channel possible. In particular, I'd like to thank my 1 Augustus tier patron, Average at Best, my Caesar tier patron, Moulay Cherkawi, and my 2 Consul tier YouTube members, Dan Smith and Evgeny Volkov.